All right, well, I'm going to get started then. For those that don't know me, I'm Kevin Mack. And I'm going to be talking about 12-Space, which is a CSS framework that I wrote, and it's an open source project. It's on GitHub. It's under my name, Kevin Mack, but add an 18 at the end, just because I like the number 18. So GitHub, Kevin Mack 18, and /12-space. Or you can just do a search for 12-Space on Google. That's probably a lot easier to find out. So 12-Space is based around grid systems, but it's not a grid system. And a lot of grid systems that I've used always have the same problems, like I'm designing around the grid structure itself, and my creative thought process is limited by the limitations or capabilities of the actual grid system itself. And what I wanted to do was create a grid system that is not really a grid system, but it's really based around being a structure system. So that's what 12-Space is. It's a structure system, and it's really inspired by traditional grid systems, but looks at building out containers and how the content will really be displayed around it. So this is kind of like my quote for what 12-Space is. It's an off-the-grid grid system. Even though I said it wasn't a grid system, it's inspired by grid systems, and you can create a grid system using 12-Space, but it is not a grid system. It is a structure system. So really why it's different than a grid system is because of these things. In this slide I was really inspired by some like furniture warehouse sales. You know how they always have like the bright colors and lots of exclamation. I did this slide about 2:30 in the morning, and I didn't eat all day either, so this was roughly put together. At one point I had like, wow, this is great. And like there was like a dog in the corner that said in Comic Sans, like, wow, this is wonderful. But so anyway, so 12-Space has these three main components of layering, expanding, and offsetting, and more. And the and more is there's a bunch of helper classes, and as I go through demos and explain how to use it, you'll see some of the helper classes. And it's really just about how you structure and architect solutions for front-end projects. One of the big things for me is, working primarily as a front-end developer or UI architect, that when you work with someone that is not at a senior level or experienced with front-end, and you start seeing their HTML, their DOM structure, and their CSS, and you review it, you're like, I wish I just did this. So the idea of having 12-Space is for people that maybe know about front-end, but they don't necessarily know how to write it correctly. They can just plug and play and use 12-Space to actually architect and build really great solutions in the front end. I'm not looking at you. You're just really beautiful. So 12-Space is Sass-based, which is awesome. And I'm assuming that everyone here has some knowledge of Sass, and some of the stuff that I'm talking about may be a little bit more advanced Sass. And the principles of BEM, which BEM is a methodology, live, breathe it nowadays, and this is almost nearly required that you have to know something about BEM. And if you know BEM, you can pick up 12-Space really, really quickly. And it's an object-oriented CSS framework. So that's a lot of buzzwords, but that's what it is. As I said, 12-Space focuses on the context of the content. And what that means, there's two different ways to approach building a container for a website. There's containers for content or content for containers. And the difference between those two is whether or not you have the content ahead of time. So I have my copy, I have my assets, and I'm building a container around it. Or I'm saying I'm going to design a container and then I'm going to shove some content in there at the end. And that's usually the traditional way of doing it, is we build out these really nice designs and we're like, well, what does the copy say? And I imagine my headline is going to be about 10 characters and it ends up being a sentence or a paragraph. It just doesn't work. But 12-Space is really based around building out containers or modules that are around the context of the content. And it can work in both ways. So why use 12-Space? Yeah.
Can you keep in that in mind, got a project coming up where we're going to build 10 templates?
Mm-hmm.
And almost 1,000 pages need to be ported over.
Yeah.
Those templates. If anything comes to mind if you're going through this, like, Jesse, pay attention.
Literally, as I'm presenting, I'll be like, this is it.
Can you solve my problem?
This is it right here. So why use 12 space? I just broke it down into these 3 little bullets. I'm sure I could probably have thought of more, but keep it simple. And again, I did this really late at night. And I just wanted to put something out there that gave an introduction to what 12 space is, how to use it, and why to use it, and then basic setup to get you running with it. So 12 space can be used to create design patterns. It's really focused around reuse and rapid prototyping. And I originally had slides for each one of these, and I was like, that's too much detail. So as it comes to design patterns, it just means you're creating structures that are kind of unique to your content needs and your design needs. And you're going to be creating flexible patterns that can be reused throughout a site. At the end, I'm going to show you a demo of resource.com and how we actually use the same modules across different pages, and just applying different helper classes and different contexts around that content, we were able to create the same module or the same structure but look very different across 2 different pages or multiple templates. That is something good for you to know, Jesse. And reuse, it's just I kind of started building 12 space without realizing it. I was writing the same code over and over again, and I just got kind of sick of it. So I had this little starter kit of Sass mixins, placeholder selectors, and different containers, and I don't know, back and forth that I always use on every project. And I was just like, I should put these together into one framework, and that's what I did. So I was just sick of rewriting the same code over and over again, and this framework is really just to give you a head start. So you're not starting at point 0, you're starting with something. And a lot of these structures or modules or containers are the same thing for every project. So why not use something that's already supported? And the support for, I kind of skipped over this, but the support for 12 space is IE 8 and above. And one of my goals for 12 space is to consistently look at the latest browser. So once I get this first release out of this, the first official release, I'm going to look at introducing Flexbox or whatever becomes a stable for positioning and display types without losing support for the old browser. So there'll be variables that you can say, hey, I want to support all the old browsers, or I just want to do the latest and greatest. So you can use the same syntax with 12 space and support the latest browsers, or support all the browsers that you want. So rapid prototyping. This has been really huge, and ever since I started doing more and more designing in the browser, again, before I put this together, it was kind of a pain, and it took me a long time just to show what I was trying to explain to a designer or someone on the creative side, someone that wasn't thinking the way that I think when I'm like, oh, I can just write the code. It just looks like this, this, and this. So now with 12 space, I can easily apply some classes and some of these structures and actually show them what I'm actually meaning when I'm talking about structures with the website. So you can easily use 12 space to build out some structures, and as I go through some examples, you'll see how easily you can build these. So heading on what structures are, and I keep saying structures, but you can think of them almost more of like modules, and they're starting to get closer and closer to a template, but they're not a template. They're a piece of a page, they're a part of a page, and structure to me doesn't contain UI and UX. So at the bottom of this slide, I have the 4 basic buckets of what makes a website, and this is from a presentation that Tim Vonderlo and I did 2 months ago called BEM for Designers, and we define a website really as these 4 buckets. There's some additional ones, but these are the 4 major ones of content, structures, UI, and UX, and each of them can live independently of each other, but the one that's really tied the most important out of all these is the content, and structures to be flexible to meet the demands of that content. And again, that's what 12 space really is. And if you keep all these in mind as you're approaching development and architecting out solutions and building out websites, you can easily have reuse from these. And your structures, as I said, can be completely different from page to page by just applying your same structures and maybe using different UI or different UX to those structures. And again, we'll go through some examples of that. So the basics. Pause for water. So I'm going to go through how you just get set up, a basic setup of 12 space on your machine. And it's going to have a folder structure with a basic HTML file, an assets directory, SCSS folder, and a CSS folder for the compiling of the Sass file. So inside here you can see that there's an index file, and there's the asset folder, and the SCSS and the CSS. Inside the Sass file, the SCSS folder, I just have a styles.scss, and this is where I'm going to use to actually import 12 space. So inside here, you can go to GitHub, and you can either download a zip of 12 space, or you can clone it. And for right now, you're just going to have to paste it in here. In the future, I'm hoping to have this be included in Bower, a little bit easier instructions on how to get started. Basically, you go to GitHub, pull down 12 space, and you'll copy and paste it. So there are the three files that are included. There's 12 space, the helper classes, and the variables of 12 space. And you'll see that they're shown inside my SCSS folder. So the next step to get started is I'm just going to import 12 space in there. So do import 12 space. And then what I'm going to do is just open up command terminal and compile my Sass in terminal. So I'm just going to do a Sass watch, and then target my folders and my SCSS folder, and output it to my CSS folder. This is very 101 Sass intro. But it's as easy as that, and right now I have my CSS folder, and I've compiled out 12 space into my project, and you can see that I have styles.scss at the top of my header, and now I am able to use 12 space. So to get started, I'm going to have this parent block, and it's called space-12, and that's how you start every instance of 12 space. So space _12. Close this, and then inside here I'm going to put a child element, and it's going to have space _cell. And with the default settings, these are the naming conventions of 12 space. I'm just going to put in some content here. So what this has done is it's created just a cell, and this is actually going to be floating off to the left-hand side of my page. I'm going to copy this and paste it again, and now I've created a secondary element. And once I save and refresh the browser, you can see that I have content on the left and on the right. And that's a basic setup of 12 space. And it's going to actually expand with my browser as I get smaller and as I get bigger. And what it does is it doesn't have any defined widths, because 12 space doesn't have any restrictions. So it's up to you to define those restrictions, those max widths that your container, your parent container width, and 12 space is just going to expand to fit your parent container. So in this example, there was no parent container. It's just expanding the width of the viewport of the browser. So it goes from the far left and the far right. So this is the basic syntax for getting started. There's space cell, and the block has space --12.
Would that max width container go inside the space --12 though?
In an example coming up, I throw in a container, but you can put a container max width on space --12 if you wanted to. So, but this is before we get into some of the modifiers, and once we throw in the modifiers, they'll come together, and you'll wonder why it's called 12. I'll have an answer why it's called 12 space. So this setup just gives you a left and right. It comes in very handy. So it just looks at the nth child of even and odd.
So it's just by convention that the second one is on the right.
Uh-huh.
If you put the third one in there, is it?
It will go actually to the next line and be on the left.
Okay.
So 12 space. Why it's called 12 space? The containers inside add up to 12. So if you imagine that was a row, so there's a row and you have these containers, and I'll show you the syntax of what the modifiers look like for this, but they add up to 12. So in this next example, I have a 2-column, and I'm going to have a container on the left that has 5 spaces and one on the right that is 7 spaces. So those add up to 12. And it being added up to 12 means that it's on one line. In this next example, I'm moving away from just terminal and Sass watch, and I'm using grunt, so don't be alarmed, like wondering how saving and updating in the browser is happening. And I'm also going to throw in a couple helper classes just for presentation to add some styling to it so it's not so vanilla. So here we get started again using the same syntax as before. So space --12, close that. And then we add space _cell. Fill this in with some content. Duplicate that. And so you can see the left and right again. And now we're going to get into actually using the modifier and how it adds up to 12. So here I'm going to add --5, which is a modifier for the cell, and --7. What this now will do is make the cell on the left be 5 spaces and the cell on the right be 7 spaces. So you can see that up on the screen, that it's actually taking up 5 spaces and 7 spaces, and it's filling up the max width of the parent container, because right now there is no width on there, and it's completely fluid. In this next step, I'm going to add in a background so you can actually see the spaces, so it makes a little sense to it. Just adding a background that is 12 different columns. So here you'll see that. There we go. And then we have the space cell, and again it's 5 and 7, and those add up to 12. And then you can see off to the side, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Pretty basic. 5 plus 7 equals 12. There it is expanded out. Still taking up the 5 and 7 spaces. This may not seem groundbreaking. It's really not, and nothing about 12-space is. But as I move forward and get into the layering and expanding, that's where it kind of brings it together and breaks away from traditional grid systems. So in the 5-7 example, I can easily make a 7-5. It's just reversing the DOM. And if I wanted to also change it to be maybe 2 spaces and 10 spaces, well, I just change that modifier from 5 to 2 and the 7 to 10. So you just saw the reverse, and here's the 2 and 10. And it's as easy as that. Now, one of the things that I like to call out with anything that's dealing with like structures, and especially when you start thinking about RWD, and I have a slide on RWD in regards to 12-space, is the mobile versus desktop debate. Like, where do you start mobile? Where do you start desktop? And to me, I always just see it as the difference, and this is simplifying it extremely, it's just adding columns or reducing columns or turning columns into rows, and that's a really good way of summarizing it. And you can use 12-space for doing mobile first or desktop first. It's just the difference of adding columns or removing columns or adding rows. And with that, I like to say that you should target mobile first, desktop first, not as your whole overall project, but individual structures. So maybe a structure that has content that's relevant to a mobile user, start that mobile and build up from there. And if it's something that's more meant for someone to be on the desktop, start desktop first and start moving down to mobile. So really focusing on the context of the content in that way, and then applying like your strategy of how you approach developing structures. So now getting into a 3-column example, we're going to make a 3, 5, 4, which again adds up to 12. So these are all going to be in one row, and you can do any combination. So we're going to have a column on the left that's 3 spaces, one on the middle that's 5, and one on the far right that's 4 spaces. So we're just going to change that first one from being 2 to 3, this guy over to 5, and then just copying it one more and making it 4. So now I will have a 3-column grid. And it's taking up the spaces, as you can see with the alignment of the background. So anything that adds up to 12 is going to be on one row. So in the example of 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, I lost count, but say I said it 12 times, you'll get something that looks like this. And then what happens is if it's over 12, so say we go back to the 5, 7, and then we have plus 8. It's not going to continue on the same row. It's actually going to break to the next line or go and create a new row. So 5 plus 7 plus 8 plus 4 is actually going to give me a 2-column on the first row that has 5 spaces and one on the right that has 7, and then a second row that has 8 on the left and 4 on the right. So that looks like this. And I have one call out on this one. I added an additional helper class just to help identify the spaces. So if you can look around these, it may be hard to see on the screen, but there's an outline around them. It's just called children outline dash dash, I think 000. So it's just to help you identify the spaces inside there. So here we go from the 5, 7, and we'll just add in a space that's bigger than that. And you can see that it drops down. So right there, I have one extra space at the top, but it's not enough to fit that 8 space inside there. I can make it 1 and it would fit. Again, that would add up to 12. But going back to the example of 5, 7, 8, 4, here it is. Now I'm just going to add some background colors to help identify these, and these start becoming more closer to a structure. I'm adding also in padding, which is another Sass library that I wrote, and it's about adding units to containers or to your project. So there's that the 5, 7, 8, 4 setup, and seeing it across. Next piece is equal columns, and these can be used with any combination. So what this actually gives you is you identify how many columns you want, and they're going to all be equal. Say if I wanted a 3-column structure, I would just identify it as a 3-column structure, and then inside there it's going to each of those 3 columns are going to take up 4 spaces. So it does that for you. And how that syntax looks is I have space dash 12 at the top, and I have the cells inside. I'm going to remove the modifiers on the elements and just make them back to space cell. I'm going to go to space double dash 12 and change it to space double dash equal double dash 2 to show 2-column. So you can see that those are now equal. That's at 1. 4, so they're taking up 3 spaces. There it is at 12, taking up 1 space each, and so on. And how the math actually works on there, it's 12 divided by whatever, how many columns you want in there, and that's how many spaces they'll take up. You can add more in there too, and they'll all keep that as it line breaks down. This was incredibly useful on some of the projects I worked on recently, especially as we went across different landscapes and looked at different design concepts and said, well, how many columns should it be? It was just a changing of one number to see it laid out differently. So you can think of it as 3 times 4 equals 12, or actually if it's a 3-column grid, you could think of it as 12 divided by 3, and they each would be 4 spaces each. So one of the pieces about this is it keeps equal overflow, and this is incredibly helpful for like product listings. So here's this one. I made the second column a little bit longer, so you can see that the second row is actually not trying to fill in that space in the top row like it would traditionally do, unless you were clearing it after each one. So by that I mean this guy right here, without using that equal, would be moving up at the top. So I'll show you a comparison without using equal and using just 12 space, and then the spaces being equal to 4 each, to try to show you the comparison of using equal and non-equal. So here's the version without it using equal. You can see that it's just trying to fill in the gap. And that's just the traditional behavior of floats and positioning. And that's usually not the desired look and feel that you want. And that's why this was included inside there. Back and forth on that. So the next piece is offset, and this is the ability to layer a column in a position either positively or negatively. So having one container on top of another, another one on top of another, you can actually control which the z-index is of those two. And a lot of people are like, well, that never comes up. But I've seen these patterns almost on every single project that I've done in the past. And one of my examples I'll definitely show probably one of those situations that have come up. And the idea of including this in here is that you can write your DOM in the way that it should be across the full landscape, and then make the actual structure or how the DOM is written fit the design needs. And one of those examples is like the imaging, an image layering on top of text, and how you actually deal with those together. So let's go back to the 5, 7 example. And let's offset the 7 a -2 space. So what that will actually do is in the offset negative, you're subtracting that number. So I have a 5 space on the left and a 7 space on the right. But when I move it -2 spaces, it actually acts as 5 space, so I actually gain 2 more spaces. Let me show you that example. And the syntax for this is space underscore cell dash dash offset dash dash negative dash dash the amount that I want to use, amount of spaces I want to move it. So that's 2 spaces. And to really identify and show how this is layered on top of it, I'm going to make that white have a little bit of opacity on it. So you can see that's on top of it by 2 spaces. I can easily change how many spaces that moves. So here's 1 space. And actually go completely negative off my canvas. And the really nice thing about doing that is, because it's how this works, it's not going to give me overflow on my Y. And I'm not going to have the random bar at the bottom that looks like it's an error. And here I've added a position relative -2, which is one of the helper classes inside of 12 space, which adds a relative to that green space and actually puts it on top of the one on the right. So even though in the DOM, the one on the right should be showing first, it should win the hierarchy of it, I've overwritten it by adding the helper class position dash relative dash dash 2, meaning that its Z index is above the guy on the right. And that's how it looks. So with that example, we gained 2 spaces. So now I have the ability to use those spaces even more. I can start layering and getting even crazier with it. So here's how this would look. So again, you can see those 2 spaces on the far right, and copy this and fill in another guy. Let's just make it 2 spaces. And there we have another, some more space to use in there. I can also do, on any of the elements, do the same offsetting. So I'm going to move this guy over. And you can see that the whole thing moves too. This is a really great solution for when people have that discussion about going off the canvas. So what happens when my browser is bigger than 1600 pixels? Like we always design, I don't know, if the traditional Photoshop file seems to always be 1000, 1024, 1400, or 1600. But it's like, well, what happens after you get outside of 1600? Well, you can use the expand, the offset negative and expand to really fill those gaps of what's happening outside of your container. So this next example is the offsetting positively. So that was just showing you negative, and the positive offset works a little bit differently than the negative. So as I said earlier, that the negative offset, you had a 5 and 7, you subtracted the 2 negative spaces, which gave me 2 more spaces. That sounded really confusing, but it allowed us to gain spaces. This does the exact opposite. It moves it over 2 spaces, so it actually, we lose one of those 12 spaces. So I have this 5. If I'm moving it over 2, it's going to be actually 7 plus 7 spaces. So the space negative works in your benefit to add additional spaces in your row, and offset positive actually uses up spaces and takes up additional room. So here's that example. And the syntax again is space cell dash dash offset 2. And you can see that's moved over 2. So my 5 and 7, it dropped my 7 to the next row because it's actually 14. Now I could resolve that if I wanted those on the same row as making that 7 space actually 5 spaces, because then again we're back to adding up to 12. That's a very basic example, but it does come in handy.
You said you can make it 5 spaces, I don't think. Can you also offset it by -2?
You can also offset it by -2 if you wanted to. Yeah. And you could also make it 5 and then expand it 2 spaces off your canvas. So here's just some additional offsetting here, just to show you subtracting them and adding them up to 12. And again, it's all about how it adds up to 12. And the offset, if it's positive, you're adding those in to the number of your cell space, and if it's negative, you're subtracting it. And that's as complex as probably this framework gets. So one thing I'm going to skip over really quick is the layering and offset of the offset negative and positive for the children elements, because I'm going to get into that in expanding and also in gaps. But it has that capability. So layering and expanding is in the current release that's on GitHub, but I'm actually moving away from expanding on the block to element level, so that space _cell and those modifiers is no longer going to have expanding capabilities, just because there's really no need. It's kind of fulfilled by the same experience from offset and also in gap, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it is still kept in for the child elements. So again, relating back to BEM, we have a block, which is space _12, but that can also be a complex block where the child elements can be their own block. So space space, double underscore, cell, and their modifiers can be a block where they have their own child elements inside of it. It sounds a lot more confusing than what it is, but it just basically means there's a parent, there's a child, and then there's a grandchild of that. And I can offset that child element by the parent space. So here's this example. This happens all the time. Here's this header. I expect it to be short. Now we're going to make it really long. And now I expected that copy to go on top of my image, but it doesn't. So what I need to do is actually expand this child element to be on top of the image. So I do space double dash 12, the same as the parent, double modifier 5, and then I do double underscore expand dash dash 7. So now this is going to expand the full width of the 12 spaces. So it's 5 plus 7 to give me 12. So now my title that was once getting cut off is now layered on top of my image on the side, and it works across the whole landscape. Just to highlight this, I'm going to make it a background color green and then subtract different expansions so you can see how it's actually expanding across the board. Use the background image to identify how it's moving to. And again, this is incredibly helpful for responsive sites because a lot of times you see people rewrite the DOM on how it may look in mobile or how it may look on desktop. And this piece of functionality allows you to write the DOM the way that you should be writing it in proper structure and in best practices, and then kind of expand its capabilities just through CSS. For those that don't know, the image on the right is using placeholder. That's an image, just so you know. And this was using, again, position relative dash dash 12, double dash 2, which is one of the helper classes that's in 12 space. So I mentioned gaps earlier when I was talking about expand at the element level, and this is kind of one of the pieces that's replaced it. And what gaps are, they're the spaces that are in between your containers. So as I create a module and I want to have something that's maybe one gap on the left, looking here, left, and then 4 spaces, and then 2, and then another 4 spaces of my content, and then another gap. So it's like these 2 blocks here with even spaces in between. I can use gaps to create that structure. So that it looks like this. The syntax for it is space, double underscore, gap, double dash, left, double dash 1. You can also do right. So it's the difference between how many gaps I want on the left and how many I want on the right. And there I've created this structure. So there's that 1 space, 4 spaces, 2 spaces, 4 spaces, 1 space. If I go over and adds up, again it breaks down because it's bigger than 12. But you can get some really funky designs out of this, and this was actually a structure that we used at resource.com. So gaps are also available at the child elements. So using space double underscore cell, the modifier, so this is using that element name, and then appending a double underscore gap, and then the left, and how many spaces. You can see that I'm a 4 space is moving, different spaces. And it keeps consistent to the parent, which a lot of times when I've written this before, my spacing was not equivalent to this parent or my global spacing. It became relative to the parent, and using this syntax allows me to keep my space consistent with my global spacing. So meaning if I want to move over I'm 4 space to here, I can easily do that. And designing in this way, again, is designing modules and keeping them kind of separate to themselves allows for reuse, because a lot of times when you think I'm developing a module over here, I'm developing another one here and another one over here, and I bring them together, well, the alignment gets all screwed up. And using this syntax will allow you to keep consistent gutters and consistent spacing and widths across your page, no matter how you reuse them. So maybe on one page your container's this wide, and on another page it's this wide. It will still align with the parent spacing. So this is one that a couple developers don't really like that much, but I love this because tables were probably the best and worst things that ever happened to the web, and I totally miss them nowadays. And it seems like we've tried so hard just to recreate what tables do. So I'm bringing them in here for 12 space, and I'm just using the CSS properties to enable use for properties. That is like the worst written slide ever. Table properties able to be used. So yeah. So moving forward, here's the 5-7 example, and I'm going to turn this over to a table. So the first thing to do is I need to remove the modifiers on the children. I'm sorry, add a modifier to the parent, and then add that modifier below. So now I have 5 and 7. You can see that they're equal heights because they're table, which is very difficult not to do outside of a table. I have equal height columns. Fantastic. But then you can see that this copy on the right is a little bit longer. And if I make it even longer, ridiculously long, you can see my content on the left. It's kind of flat at the top. What if I wanted to center it? I can use one of the helper classes of 12 space, vertically align dash dash middle, and there it is. And I can also align it on the bottom, just like that. And that is super, super helpful when you're doing development and designing in the browser. And the support for that is IE8 and above, which is really, really nice. So, tables. They do have limitations though, and especially in 12 space, this isn't my fault, it's just how tables act. You have to define them as a width. So everything else that we've talked about are block elements. So they're going to contain the width of the browser by default, because block width auto will expand the browser width or be around the content width itself. So the parent needs to have 100% to fulfill the constraints of its parent. So that's an issue, but you can work around it easily. And I've been writing some helper classes for containers that will probably be in a future release of 12 space and how you can implement parent containers and container holders for widths, and especially dealing with stuff like this. And this is the other annoying part, is because it's tables, all your cells and columns are equal across the board. So I can't have one row that I want 5, 7, the next one 4, 8. It's whatever's defined first. It's going to be 5 and 7 all the way across the board, even though if I try to explicitly say I want it to be that, it's not going to be. You have to add another wrapper around it, and there's a class selector in here that's actually for that. It's called space double underscore row, which will allow you to do that capability. Or you can just wrap it again with another space double dash table dash 12. You can't use the equal either, which is a huge bummer, because that's one of my favorite things. Again, it goes back to the same issues with the previous bullet there. And you can't do layering or gaps at the element level, but you can do them at the child level. But you can do alignments vertically, which is cool. So at this point in like all the examples, I think I've touched on whether or not I called it out. There's been an example of some of these helper classes, and in this first release of 12 space, it's kind of limited, and I'm hoping that this is something that the community can get behind and developers here can add, really create like this expansion pack for 12 space. So this is what's included in there for initial launch, and the only thing that I didn't cover on in one of the demos was one of the display types. So just really quick, looking at this guy on the right, on the left, I'm a space. I'm going to turn it into a block by putting a span around it and then saying class block, and there it's now a block element. So now I have I'm in space. So all those display types are in there. They're really helpful. So no RWD. And this was completely intentional because this is, again, one of the problems that I have with grid systems are they define the way that your containers are going to break. And I don't know how you can do that unless I know what my content's going to be. So then I'm supposed to develop my content around these breakpoints and these containers that don't fit my needs. Well, that doesn't make sense. So no media queries are included in 12 space, and it's up to you to decide where and how to use those. So my suggestion is to use helper classes and to extend the structure functionality. So again, the same way that you create a structure, and maybe on one page it's a 3-column that I want to break to 2-column. Maybe on another page that 3-column, I always want to keep it 3-column. And the way that I can do that is just using helper classes to extend that functionality. And again, it increases reuse and prevents redundant code. So this next demo, I'm going to show how you can turn it into ready for RWD. So here's this guy, the 5 and 7 example again with the image. And what I want to do is make the image go on the bottom once it gets down to 500 pixels. This is a really bad example, but at least we'll prove the point how easy you can use 12 space for RWD. So I'm going to add this helper class that says make me RWD. And then I'm going to go to this Sass file, and I'm just going to write make me RWD, media, screen, and max width 500 pixels. And then I'm going to do an absolute div and say float none and width auto, which will now change my structure from 5 to 7 to be just stacked on top of each other, so 2 rows when I get down to 500. There we go. And it's as easy as that. I mean, that's a very simple example, but you can see how you can expand on that. And what I've actually been doing is I've been creating placeholder selectors for my RWD pieces and then extending them to specific modules that I need. So then I don't even have to write this per instance or even include it on my helper classes, include it as a helper class. Which gets me to variables. And this is there's 2 main pieces in variables right now. It's the ability to override default output naming convention. So space and cell. We can change that. And we're going to change it to foobar. Why not? So here's space and cell. We can easily change that by just going to variables. And this really long name in here, change it from space, and we'll write foo. And for the element, we'll change it to bar. So now what this does is, when it compiles out, I can now use foo and bar instead of space and cell. So you can use any naming syntax or convention that you want, just a combination, and it uses Ben. There's something I was going to say about that, but I can't remember. Oh well. Variables, you can also turn out the output. So there's a lot of garbage that happens, especially as you design in the browser, and the more and more I've done it and more opportunities that I do it, it's just like I realize like halfway through the project you're like, oh, I've been designing in the browser and I'm not using half of my stuff, and I've extended all this stuff, and you look at your containers or your selectors and it's like this long. Well, 12 space out of the box kind of has that problem, but it's not really a problem because 12 space is meant for rapid prototyping and reuse, and then you have the ability to override and change out the selectors however you find fit. So you can turn off the output and then extend them, which I now remembered what my last thought was on the last one, which we'll cover it on this slide. So Sass has placeholder select, 12-space has placeholder selectors. So everything that I talked about was space --12 or space _cell in all the modified versions of them. They keep their true form as a placeholder selector. So by using % in any of those names, you can always use it and extend it out, and it won't actually compile out as a selector, which is really, really nice because you can create custom reusable structures for your projects that fit your whole naming convention, even if it's not BEM. All you have to do is be familiar with 12-space. So in this example, I'll show you how that's done. So looking at this 5-space, and I go to inspect, you can see how much crap is in here. And in reality, all I need is a 5-space. I don't need all this junk. I shouldn't call it junk, but I am. So I'm going to turn this to false, which is now going to turn off that as an output or as a selector. And I'm going to go to my project. I'm going to create my own naming convention, which I'm going to call it feature zone 1, just because I want to put a 1 there. And I'm going to call this content. I know some people will probably be pissed about that I'm giving it such semantic names, but you can call it whatever you want. So I go in here, I go feature 1, I'm going to do add extend, % space --12, copy this, and then add the elements inside there of content. And then going back to what it was before, _, cell, --5. Do the same for images. And change it to --7. Save it. Now you can see that it goes back to how it was before. And now I look at my inspect, and there's really not all that junk there. I can also reverse it very easily. Back to that one example. Now I can just do it in my CSS. Extremely helpful to do this way. So I can take advantage of using 12-space without actually having the load and weight of it in my output. I can also turn off the helper classes inside there because they also get compiled out by default. So this image has this full in there. I'm going to change it to a naming convention of __ image. And then I'm going to add extend image.full. And now I've removed all my placeholders, all my helper classes and 12-space, and I get the same look and feel. And the only thing that's actually being compiled out here is 4 selectors. So to bring this into real life, I've worked on now 4 projects using 12-space, and the actual release on GitHub right now is not up to date with the one that's on my machine. That sounds horrible, but that's because I've been working through some kinks on it and making sure that it's completely solid. So the recent project that I used this on was resource.com redesign, which is a fully redesign of resource, new brand, brand new look. We designed in the browser for half of it, designed in Photoshop for half of it. We changed the concept maybe 8 different times, and without 12-space, I think I probably would have killed myself. So you can thank 12-space for that. Yeah. So here are some of the structures that were built in 12-space for resource.com, and they're fully responsive. And then here are some of the more sophisticated structures that were used, and these are used throughout the whole site in different contexts. What I'm going to do is turn on Asset Template Guide, which I'm doing a presentation on this in a couple weeks, and think of Asset Template Guides as its relationship of print or package design for the web for designers. So it's applying concepts of package and print design for the web. And you can see that these are fully responsive and how they move across the whole landscape. So you can see that layering behind everything as I'm moving too. and how I was able to just focus on the responsive and not really focus on what I didn't need to be focused on. I got to focus on how I was going to make it responsive and not how I was actually going to write the same code over and over again. There you go. And then the next piece is just showing you some examples of resource.com. So those are the same structures I just showed you, but in the context of how they're actually used. And then here's one of our case studies. Again, all those modules being reused. So what's really cool about these are, you know, this layering effect and seeing it across the whole landscape and the capabilities of doing it. In reality, this guy actually gets cut off at certain landscapes, and on here you can see the full thing. So back to like what I was saying earlier, like having the ability to go off my screen and expand inward and outward. Does anyone have any questions? Just one quick little slide after this. So what's next for 12 Space is the official release of version 1, which will be hopefully bug-free. And more design layouts. So what I'm actually going to be doing is building out a library of structures that can be reused for people and additional helper classes. And I'm hoping to see people backing this, starring it, liking it on GitHub, and sharing and expanding it. So thank you. And if you have any questions, let me know. Seriously, any questions?
So how big is the library, like including everything you compiled?
It's not that, I don't know the exact size off the top of my head. I wish I did. It's a good question. It's not too big. It's just, you can leave it in there for a production file. I just don't see why you would.
Right.
Because half the stuff you're not
Yeah,
even
like
using.
extending things,
Yeah.
like you kind of showed the deal there.
Yeah.
It's probably more production. Like using this for prototyping is good. You just kind of keep the whole thing.
Yeah.
Moving to like the production stuff. It makes sense to just use the extension.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, I mean, that's actually the approach that we did for resource.com. And then once you actually have your structures in probably like the 90% done, but it's still like in flux and changing, it's really nice that you do that at extend, because there was one of those containers, as I showed you, like that VS example. The content on the right, so on the left it had like a description of it and an image on the right. It was actually going out 2 more spaces, but we decided to pull it in, reduce it by 2 spaces. It was just a change of literally 1 character inside my CSS folder. We could go back and forth and kind of like find that right spacing until it felt right. And what was really cool about that was I updated it in one place in the CSS or in my Sass file and updated across the whole website, as opposed to updating helper classes. Any other questions? Thank you, thank you, thank you. What a weird way to end this.